The envelope was still on my kitchen table when I sat down with my coffee that Tuesday morning. I hadn't opened it yet. I'd been staring at it for 3 days. It had my son's handwriting on the front, my address, written in blue ink, slightly slanted the way he'd always written since he was a boy learning to hold a pencil. I remembered sitting next to him at this same table, guiding his small hand across lined paper, telling him to slow down, to be deliberate, to make each letter mean something. He never listened about that either. I picked up my mug and looked out the window instead. The oak tree in the backyard had finally lost its last few leaves. November, in Indiana, does. That strips everything down to the bone so you can see exactly what's standing and what isn't. I'd been doing a lot of that kind of seeing lately. My name is Gerald. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years working as a civil engineer for the county. Showed up every morning before the sun did, and retired 4 years ago with a pension that isn't lavish, but is honest. My wife, Patricia, passed 8 years ago from a heart condition that came on faster than either of us expected. We had 30 years together. We had one son. I used to think that was enough. One good son was enough. I set the mug down. I picked up the envelope. I put it back down again. Let me start from the beginning, because I think you need to understand what kind of man I am before you understand what happened, and more importantly, why I did what I did at the end. I am not a dramatic person. I do not make scenes. I do not send long text messages full of accusations. When something bothers me, I get quiet. I get methodical. Patricia used to call it my engineer brain. I look at problems as systems. I trace every failure back to its source, and I fix things properly the first time, or I don't touch them at all. I mention that because what I did in October, what I set in motion, quietly, over the course of about 3 weeks, was not an act of rage. It was the most deliberate thing I've ever done in my life. More deliberate than the day I proposed to Patricia. More deliberate than the day I signed my retirement papers. I need you to understand that. My son is 34. He married his wife 6 years ago. She's a pleasant enough woman. I've never had a problem with her personally. They have 2 children, my grandchildren, who I adore completely and who have done nothing wrong in any of this. Their kids are 7 and 4 years old, full of noise and energy, and the particular kind of chaos that makes an old house feel like a home again for a few days. That's important to remember, too, because when the story gets hard, and it does get hard, those 2 kids are why I had to be careful. Why I had to be surgical about this, instead of just blowing the whole thing apart. After Patricia died, I threw myself into work for 2 more years before I retired. Then I threw myself into the house. I rebuilt the back porch. I redid the kitchen floors. I planted a garden that Patricia had always wanted and never had time for. I kept busy, because busy is how people like me survive grief. My son called every Sunday back then, every single Sunday, without fail, at 7 in the evening. We'd talk for 40 minutes or so, the kids, his work, football, whatever. It was a ritual. I looked forward to it more than I ever told him. Then he and his wife bought a house in Colorado. A big house. Beautiful, I'm sure, though I've only seen pictures. 3 bedrooms, a finished basement, a yard that backs up to a nature preserve. They stretched for it. I knew that from the beginning. I could see it in the way my son talked about the mortgage, that particular combination of pride and anxiety that sounds like a man holding his breath underwater. I didn't say anything. A man has the right to reach for things. The Sunday calls became every other Sunday. Then, once a month, I told myself it was fine. Busy people, young family, long days. I told myself that a lot of things were fine. The first time my son called me asking for money was about 14 months after they bought the house. Not a Sunday, a Wednesday afternoon. He said the furnace had gone out and the repair was more than they had in savings right now, and could I help, just temporarily? He'd pay it back. $3,800. I transferred it before dinner. I didn't make him feel embarrassed about it. I know what it's like to be stretched thin. I know what it's like to own a house that decides to cost you money at the exact wrong moment. I sent it, and I told him not to worry about paying it back. Consider it a gift. He thanked me. He said I was the best father in the world. He said he didn't know what he'd do without me. I believed him when he said it. 4 months later, February, The middle of a cold week, he called again. My daughter-in-law had needed a procedure. Out-of-pocket costs, after insurance, were around $2,200. Could I help? I transferred it by the end of that call. June. My son's car needed transmission work, $4,100. I sent it. August. School enrollment fees for my older grandchild, private school, which they had chosen, which I had some quiet thoughts about, but kept to myself. 1,700. I sent it. By October of that first year, I had given them somewhere close to $12,000. And I want to be honest with you. I didn't keep a ledger. That wasn't who I was yet. I was just a father helping his son, the way fathers do, the way my own father would have helped me if he'd had the means. The money was mine to give. My pension is mine. The savings Patricia and I built together over 30 years are mine. I get to decide what I do with them. But something was shifting in me, slowly. The way ground shifts in winter, not dramatically, not all at once, just settling into a new position that you don't fully notice until you try to stand where you used to stand and find the floor has moved. The calls stopped being monthly. They became what I can only describe as need-based. Not enough contact in between to feel like a relationship, but reliable contact whenever something needed funding. I started keeping a ledger, not out of resentment. Out of that engineer instinct, when a pattern starts forming, you document it. You get precise. You don't assume. You look at the data. The data was not ambiguous. Between that first furnace call and last spring, I had transferred a total of $31,000 to my son and daughter-in-law in roughly 22 months, spread across 8 separate requests. I had been to visit my grandchildren twice in that entire period, both times because I drove myself there, bought my own flight when the drive got too hard on my back, and stayed in a hotel because the guest room was, as my daughter-in-law put it, in the middle of being redone. It was being redone both times. I visited, 14 months apart, which I noted and filed away. Last spring, my son called me on a Thursday evening, not a Sunday. Thursdays were apparently becoming the preferred day for this type of call. He told me he had some exciting news. His in-laws, my daughter-in-law's parents, who live in Scottsdale, had invited the whole family on a European cruise. Mediterranean itinerary, 2 weeks. Barcelona, Marseille, Rome, Athens, Dubrovnik. The in-laws were covering the cost of the cruise itself as a gift. My son said it was a once-in-a-lifetime kind of trip and they were really looking forward to it. I said that sounded wonderful. I meant it. Then he said, there were costs the in-laws weren't covering. Flights from Denver to Barcelona and back. Airport hotels on either end. Excursion fees at each port, because those weren't included in the cruise. Souvenirs, he laughed a little when he said that, as if he knew how it sounded. Spending money for 2 weeks. He'd done the math, and it was coming out to around $8,300 that they didn't currently have. Could I help? I was quiet for a moment. I want to tell you about that moment, because it was the first moment where something in me changed positions in a way that wasn't subtle. Something moved from one side of a scale to the other. I felt it physically, somewhere in my chest. I asked him if he'd thought about talking to his in-laws about covering a bit more, since they were the ones organizing the trip. He said he didn't want to put them in an awkward position. I thought about the furnace, the medical procedure, the transmission, the private school, the $31,000. I thought about the guest room that was perpetually being redone. I thought about the Sunday calls that had become Thursday calls, that had become nothing calls. I said I'd think about it and let him know. He said okay. He was quiet in a way that communicated that he'd expected a different answer. We hung up. I sat in my kitchen, this same table, and I thought carefully for a long time. Then I called my accountant. Not because I needed financial advice, because I needed a witness to what I was thinking. And my accountant has known me for 20 years and is the most level-headed man I know. I told him what had been going on, the full picture, all of it. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, Gerald, you're not describing a son with bad luck. You're describing a pattern. I told him I knew. He asked me what I wanted to do. I told him I wasn't sure yet, but I wanted to start documenting everything formally. Every transfer, every date, every stated reason. I wanted it all organized and time-stamped and clear. He said he could help me with that. I called my son back the next day and told him I'd help with the trip. I transferred $8,300. I didn't make him feel bad about it. I didn't attach conditions. I said I hoped they had a beautiful time and that I wanted to hear all about it when they got back. He thanked me. He said I was incredible. He said I was the best. The trip was scheduled for August, 3 months away. I spent those 3 months doing two things simultaneously. First, I continued being exactly the father I had always been. I called my grandchildren on their birthdays. I sent a care package to my older grandchild at the start of the school year. When my son texted me pictures of them at the Denver Zoo one weekend, I responded warmly and asked questions. I was present. I was consistent. I gave no indication that anything was different. Second, I documented everything. Every transfer, going back as far as I could reconstruct, with bank records to support each one. I organized it by date, by amount, by the reason given. My accountant helped me verify the numbers. I also, quietly and without telling anyone, made an appointment with my estate attorney. I told her I wanted to review my will. I told her I had some concerns I wanted to address. She listened to everything. She is a careful woman, precise in the way that good professionals are precise, and she did not rush me or editorialize while I talked. When I finished, she said, "You've been very clear about what you want. Let's make sure the documents reflect that exactly." We spent 2 meetings getting it right. I signed the updated documents on a Thursday in July, a Thursday, which I noticed with a kind of grim humor, and my attorney filed everything appropriately. Then I waited. August came. My son's family flew to Barcelona. I know because my daughter-in-law posted about it on social media. I don't have an account myself, but my neighbor Janet, who is 71 and sharper than most people half her age, had mentioned that my daughter-in-law had posted photos before. I asked Janet if she'd be willing to show me, and she did, sitting at her kitchen table over coffee. The photos were beautiful. My daughter-in-law in a sundress on the Barcelona waterfront. My son with a sangria at an outdoor cafe, smiling broadly. My grandchildren in tiny life jackets on a boat excursion in Dubrovnik. The bluest water I've ever seen behind them, both of them grinning with their arms out like they were flying. My grandchildren looked like they were flying. I looked at those pictures for a long time. My grandchildren had done nothing wrong. I want to be clear about that. They didn't plan any of this. They were just kids on a boat in the Adriatic Sea, and that was beautiful, and I was glad they had that moment. I closed the laptop and thanked Janet and drove home. 2 weeks later, my son called. A Thursday. He said the trip had been incredible. He said the kids still talked about the boat in Croatia every single day. He said my daughter-in-law was already trying to plan a follow-up trip to Portugal with her parents next year. I said that sounded lovely. Then he said he needed to talk to me about something. I said of course. He said that they'd come back from the trip to some financial stress. He said there had been some unexpected costs at the end, he didn't specify what, and that they were short on their mortgage payment for October and some other bills. He said he hated to ask, but he needed some help. I asked him how much. He paused. Then he said $30,000. He said it in the particular way people say large numbers when they've practiced saying them slightly too fast, as if momentum might carry it past the moment of impact. He followed it quickly with an explanation about a property tax payment that had come due, and something about his daughter-in-law's mother needing some help too, and an issue with the basement, the same basement that had been finished when they bought the house, which I had seen with my own eyes in the listing photos they'd sent me, and he talked for about 3 minutes without taking a breath. I let him finish. Then I said, "I need to think about this. I'll call you back." He said, "Okay." I said, "Can you come out here this weekend? Both of you? Bring the kids? I haven't seen them in 4 months. We can talk in person." He hesitated. He said his daughter-in-law had some things going on this weekend. I said, "Next weekend then." Another hesitation. He said he'd check. I said, "I'd really like to see my grandchildren. It's been too long." He said he'd make it work. They arrived on a Saturday. My grandchildren exploded through the front door, the way they always do, my older grandchild going immediately for the cabinet where I keep the good crackers, my younger one running directly to the backyard to look for the squirrel that apparently lives in the oak tree now, based on previous visits. I stood in the doorway of my kitchen and watched them, and felt something so complicated in my chest that I can't name it even now. My son and daughter-in-law came in behind them. They looked good, tanned from the trip, relaxed, in the way that people who have recently had a vacation are relaxed, the world still soft around the edges. We had lunch. We talked about the cruise. My son showed me photos on his phone, real photos now, not Janet's laptop, close-up and personal. My grandchildren interrupted constantly to add their own commentary. My younger one had apparently become very attached to a dolphin they'd seen from the ship in the Mediterranean, which they described in extensive detail and with tremendous authority on dolphin behavior. After lunch, the kids went outside. My daughter-in-law started to clear the dishes. I asked her if she'd mind giving my son and me a few minutes. She looked at my son. Something passed between them quickly, a flicker, a private signal. She said of course, and took her coffee to the living room. My son sat down across from me at this table. I didn't say anything at first. I got up and went to the counter and picked up a folder I had left there, and I brought it back to the table and set it down between us. Not open, just there. He looked at it. I said, "I want to show you something before we talk about money." He nodded. He was watching my face carefully. I opened the folder. Inside was a printed summary, organized, clean, the way I do things of every financial transfer I had made to them over the past 22 months. Dates, amounts, stated reasons. It ran to just over 2 pages, single-spaced. At the bottom was a total $31,412, not counting the $30,000 he was currently asking for. I let him read it. He was quiet for a long time. I watched him go through the pages. I watched his face change, not dramatically, not with the kind of expression that makes a good movie scene, but subtly, the way a landscape changes as a cloud moves across the sun. He said, "Dad, I didn't realize it had added up to that much." I said, "I know." He said, "You know we're going to pay it back. We've always said that." I said, "I know you've said that." He heard the distinction. He looked up. I said, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." He said, "Okay." I said, "When you called me 2 weeks after you got back from the Mediterranean cruise, a trip I paid for, and asked me for $30,000 more, did you think about this?" I tapped the folder. He was quiet. I said, "Did you think about what this looks like from where I'm sitting?" He started to speak. Something about the economy, about interest rates, about how hard things were right now for people their age, buying houses in expensive markets. I let him talk. I listened. When he finished, I said, "I know things are hard. They've been hard before, and you've called me, and I've helped you. Every single time. Without making you feel bad about it. Without conditions. Because you're my son, and I love you." He said, "I know that, Dad." I said, "But I need you to also know something. I need you to understand that love has never been the question here. The question is whether what's happening between us is actually a relationship, or whether it's something else." He asked me what I meant. I said, "You haven't visited me in 4 months. Before the trip, you called me, asked for money. I gave it. We talked for maybe 15 minutes. That was it. I haven't spent real time with my grandchildren since last spring, and the only reason you're here today is because I told you I needed to talk before I could answer your question." He started to say something. I said, "I'm not finished." He stopped. I said, "I've been your father for 34 years. I worked every day of your childhood and most of mine to build something that could last. Your mother and I, we didn't go on cruises. We didn't belong to any clubs. We saved carefully and we lived carefully because we wanted to make sure there was something here when we were gone. Something for you. We talked about it many times, your mother and I. What we wanted to leave behind." I paused. I looked at him. I said, "I've had some conversations this summer with my attorney. I've updated some documents. I thought you should know that." He didn't say anything. His face was very still. I reached back into the folder and pulled out a second document. This one I'd prepared with my attorney's guidance, specifically for this conversation, not the official filed version, but a plain language summary of what the updated will contained, who received what, under what conditions, and what the reasoning was. I placed it face down on the table. I said, "I want to be honest with you. I love you, I love your children. I have no interest in punishing you or hurting you or making your life harder than it already is. That's not who I am, I said, but I've spent the last few months asking myself a question that took me a long time to put into words. The question is this: am I your father or am I your resource? He looked at me. I said, because a father and a resource are not the same thing. A father gets Sunday phone calls that aren't about money. A father gets visits that aren't scheduled around a financial request. A father gets to know his grandchildren beyond the 2 days a year they explode through his front door. He said, Dad, I said, I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm not asking for anything unreasonable. I'm asking you to see me the same way I see you as a person, not as a function. I flipped the document face up and slid it across the table. He looked down at it. He started reading. I watched him read. I had thought carefully about what I wanted that document to say. It wasn't designed to punish. It was designed to tell the truth about what I valued, about what I'd observed, about what I wanted the remainder of my life and my legacy to reflect. The structure was straightforward. The house would go into a trust managed by my accountant and my attorney to be distributed in a way that would benefit my grandchildren directly. When they turned 25, their education, their own home purchases, the start of their adult lives, not passed through my son and his wife, to my grandchildren directly. My personal savings and investments would be divided. A portion to a scholarship fund at the university Patricia had attended. She never finished her degree, but she'd always wanted to. A portion to the local hospital where she'd been treated for cardiac research. A portion held in the trust for my grandchildren. A portion designated for my son, contingent on something I'll get to in a moment. The contingent portion wasn't small. I wasn't disinheriting him. I want to be very clear about that. But it was structured around something the document stated plainly, that the relationship between a parent and a child must be reciprocal to be real. That love expressed only in the direction of money is not love. That the inheritance I was leaving reflected the relationships I actually had, not the ones I wished I had. The condition for my son's portion was simple: a genuine attempt at relationship, documented over time. Not money, not financial transactions in either direction. Just presence. Sunday calls, visits that aren't requests, showing up. The document also addressed the $31,000 I had already given him, not to demand it back, but to formally acknowledge it as an advance against his share so that the accounting was honest and final, the way it should be. He read all of it. He read some parts twice. I watched him. When he finished, he set the paper down very carefully, the way you set something down when you don't trust your hands. He said, I didn't know you felt this way. I said, I know. He said, I thought you gave because you wanted to. I said, I did want to. That's not the point. The point is what happened between the times when you weren't asking for anything. He was quiet. I said, do you remember the last time you called me on a Sunday? Not about anything, just to talk? He didn't answer, which was its own answer. I said, I do. It was 14 months ago. You called to tell me you'd taken my older grandchild to a baseball game and my grandchild had caught a foul ball. You called because you were happy and you wanted to share it. That's the only Sunday call in the last 14 months that wasn't connected to a need. He looked down at the table. I said, I've thought about your mother a lot this year. Patricia would be 61 now. She would have spoiled those grandchildren completely and had exactly 0 regrets about it. But she also would have seen what I see. She would have said something sooner. She was always braver than me about the hard conversations. He didn't look up. His jaw was working the way it does when he's trying not to cry. He's done that since he was small. I said, I'm not handing you this to hurt you. I'm handing you this because I'm 63 years old, and I would like whatever years I have left to contain a real relationship with my son. Not a transactional one, a real one. This, I gestured at the document, is what happens if that's not possible. But it doesn't have to be what happens. He looked up at me then. His eyes were red. He said, I've been selfish. I know that. I've told myself stories about why it was okay, why you didn't mind, why you had plenty and it wasn't hurting you. I've told myself a lot of things. And I think I believed them because believing them was easier than looking at what I was actually doing. He said, I didn't think about what it cost you. Not the money. I mean the other thing. The other cost. I said, I know. He said, Mom would be ashamed of me. I said, I don't think shame is useful here. I think honesty is useful. And you're being honest right now, and that matters. He looked at the document again. He said, the part about the grandchildren, the trust, I think that's right. I think that's the right thing. I actually think that's better. I said, I hoped you'd see it that way. He said, I don't know if my wife... He stopped himself. I said, your wife is not my responsibility to manage, but she is someone I'd like to know better. She's been in this family for 6 years, and she's still something of a stranger to me, and I don't think that's entirely accidental. He absorbed that. I said, the 30,000. I'm not going to give it to you. He nodded. He'd known it was coming. I said, not because I can't, because it's not what either of us needs. What I can do is help you make a plan. A real one. Not a transfer, a plan. I can sit down with you and your wife and look at your actual budget and help you think through this systematically. I spent 31 years solving structural problems for a living. A budget is a structural problem. He almost smiled. It was a complicated almost smile, the kind that's mostly grief with a little something else underneath. He said, you'd do that? I said, I'll do that instead of the 30,000. Yes. He said, okay. He said it quietly, without negotiating, which told me more than anything else had. I said, I want to start over. Not pretend the last 2 years didn't happen. Just start over from here. Real calls, real visits, real relationship, and we'll see. He said, I want that too. I said, prove it, not to me, to yourself. That's the only proof that counts. My daughter-in-law came in from the living room then, not because she'd been listening, I don't think, but because the natural rhythm of the afternoon had pulled her back. My older grandchild came in behind her, crackers in hand, making a direct case for why dessert should be served immediately and in large quantities. My daughter-in-law looked between us. She read the room the way women often do, quickly, accurately, without asking for an explanation. She sat down at the table. She said, whatever happened in here, I want to know about it. My son said, Mom's will. She said, his. He said, his. Dad updated it. He showed me. She looked at me. I pushed the document across to her without saying anything. She read it more quickly than my son had. She's always been efficient. I'll give her that. When she finished, she sat with it for a moment. Then she did something that surprised me. She said, this is fair. My son looked at her. She said, Gerald, this is fair. I want to say that out loud. I think I let something happen in this family that I should have caught. I got comfortable with a version of things that wasn't right, and it was easier not to look at it directly. I'm looking at it now. She slid the document back to me. She said, the trust for the kids is actually better. For them, it's better. And the condition about relationship, she said the word carefully, as if it had weight, that's fair too. I said, I didn't want to do this to wound either of you. I want to be clear about that. She said, I know. She said, I'm going to do better. I said, I believe you. My older grandchild, who had been standing in the doorway this entire time with crackers, said with tremendous authority, can we have dessert now? I looked at my son. My son looked at me. Something passed between us that was old and deep and complicated, and maybe the beginning of something that could be okay. I said, yes. Yes. We can have dessert now. I made ice cream sundaes. My younger grandchild wanted extra hot fudge and got it. My older grandchild arranged the toppings by color, which I had not seen before and found quietly magnificent. My daughter-in-law sat at my kitchen table and asked me about Patricia. Real questions, the kind she'd never asked before, and I talked about my wife for the first time in a long time without it feeling like reopening something. My son stood at the kitchen counter and ate his sundae and watched his children and didn't say much, but every now and then he looked at me in a way that said he was recalculating something large and doing it honestly. They stayed through dinner. They stayed until the kids were starting to wilt. the particular wilt of small children who have run out of energy so completely that their entire bodies begin to droop like flowers at the end of a hot day. When they left, my son hugged me in the driveway for longer than he has since he was a teenager. He said, "I'll call Sunday." "Not next Sunday. Not sometime soon. Sunday," I said. "I'll be here." I watched the car pull out of the driveway and disappear down the street. The November air was cold and still, and the oak tree stood bare in the yard, all its structure visible now. I went inside and sat at the kitchen table. The folder was still there, and the document and the summary of 22 months and $31,000, and all the Thursdays that were not Sundays. I put them back in the folder. I put the folder in a drawer, not in the trash in a drawer, where things go that you want to be able to find again if you need to, but that you hope you never need to. I poured myself a small glass of whiskey, which I almost never do. Patricia had a saying. She had a lot of sayings. She was a person full of sayings, the way some people are full of songs. They just come out of her constantly, but one in particular has been in my head all year. She used to say, "Gerald, the hardest thing isn't loving people. The hardest thing is loving them out loud, when it would be easier to just stay quiet." She was right, as she usually was. That Sunday, at 7 in the evening, my phone rang. My son's name was on the screen. I picked up. He said, "Hi, Dad." I said, "Hi, son." He said, "I just wanted to talk. Nothing specific, just talk." I said, "Good, I'm glad." And we did. For 53 minutes, which I know because I looked at the call log later. I won't pretend I didn't. We talked about my grandchild's new obsession with collecting rocks. Apparently every rock is special and has a name now, and the collection currently lives on the window ledge of their bedroom and numbers over 40. We talked about the football season and whether it was going anywhere interesting. We talked about my garden and whether I was going to try tomatoes again next year or admit defeat, which I have not yet decided. He asked me what his mother's favorite flower had been. I told him. He said he wanted to plant some in the yard. I told him the best month to do it and which varieties were hardiest in Colorado winters. He wrote it down. I heard him writing. When we hung up, I sat in the quiet kitchen and looked out at the oak tree, and I thought about systems, about how a structure fails not all at once, but gradually, one small compromise, then another, each one made quietly and with good intentions, until you look up one day and realize the whole thing has shifted into something unrecognizable. And I thought about how a structure can also be rebuilt, carefully, honestly, with proper materials and enough time. I went to bed that night feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not quite peace, not quite happiness, but something in the neighborhood of both. The specific feeling of a man who has said the true thing at last and found that saying it, however late, however hard, did not destroy what he was most afraid of losing. The folder is still in the drawer. The will is still filed. And every Sunday evening, at 7 o'clock, my phone rings.